Hello everyone, welcome back to Dread Report. Today's episode examines the 9 most creepy true ghost encounters from Appalachian small towns. These cases come from remote valleys, silent ridgelines, and communities where nightfall arrives earlier than anywhere else. Each account was drawn from witness testimonies, archived reports, and a series of private interviews conducted over the past several months. We begin with the quieter incidents. Unexplained figures observed along abandoned service roads. Footsteps recorded in houses long since emptied. Patterns that appeared isolated at first, confined to a handful of mountain hollows where the population has been declining for decades. But as more statements surfaced, a troubling consistency emerged. Individuals who claimed no knowledge of each other described the same static-laced silhouettes, the same cold drafts that moved against the direction of the wind. From the backroads of eastern Kentucky to the outskirts of northern Tennessee, these encounters began crossing county lines. Similar reports surfaced in law enforcement logs, medical notes, and handwritten letters left anonymously at local stations. The pattern grew outward, subtle yet persistent, hinting at a presence that did not remain fixed to any single location. For safety and confidentiality, names and identifying details have been altered. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Dread Report for daily true horror investigations. Now, let us begin. I was 17 when the lights started moving through Miller's Hollow, and I swear to God I still don't sleep right because of it. That stretch of road sits about 12 miles outside Harlan, back where the mountains fold in on themselves and the hollows get so deep the sun barely touches bottom even at noon. My granddaddy used to say that some places in these mountains just aren't meant for people anymore, that the land remembers things we've tried to forget. I didn't understand what he meant until that autumn. It started in late September, right when the leaves were turning and the air got that iron smell it gets before the real cold sets in. I was driving home from my shift at the lumber yard, taking the back way because the main road was being torn up for repairs. Miller's Hollow Road wasn't much more than cracked asphalt and gravel, winding through black oak and pine so thick you couldn't see 10 feet into the trees on either side. There were maybe 3 houses along that whole 5-mile stretch, all of them set way back from the road, their porch lights like distant stars through the branches. The first time I saw the lantern, I thought it was someone's porch light I'd never noticed before. It was hovering maybe 30 yards ahead, right at the edge where my headlights started to fade into darkness. Just a pale yellow glow, swaying gentle-like, the way a lantern would if someone was carrying it slow and careful. I didn't think much of it at first, figured maybe old Earl Hutchins was out checking his fence line or hunting coon. Earl was the kind of man who still did things the old way, wouldn't touch a flashlight if he had a kerosene lantern handy. But as I got closer, the light didn't move off to the side like it should have. It stayed right there in the middle of the road, swaying back and forth, back and forth. I slowed down to maybe 15 miles an hour, leaning forward over the steering wheel, trying to make out who was holding it. That's when I realized the glow wasn't warm at all. It was cold-looking, the color of old bones or milk that started to turn. And there was something else. The way it moved wasn't quite right. It didn't bob up and down like a person walking. It just swayed, smooth and even, like it was hung from something I couldn't see. I stopped the truck about 20 feet away and sat there with the engine running, my hands tight on the wheel. The light kept swinging, and that's when I saw the shape behind it. At first I thought it was just the fog playing tricks, making shadows where there weren't any. But the longer I stared, the more solid it became. There was a figure there, I'm sure of it. Tall and thin, wearing what looked like old clothes, the kind you'd see in photographs from my great-grandmother's time. And the face, Jesus, the face. It was there and it wasn't, like looking at someone through water, features that kept shifting and fading, never quite clear enough to make out, but clear enough to know you were looking at something that had once been human. Then the lantern turned toward me. I don't mean the person holding it turned. The light itself rotated, like an eye swiveling in a socket, and fixed on my truck. The glow got brighter, harsh and cold, and I could feel it somehow. Feel it pressing against my windshield like a hand made of ice. My breath started fogging up the glass, even though the heater was running full blast. I sat there frozen, my foot on the brake, every instinct screaming at me to throw the truck in reverse and get the hell out of there. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe it was the same stupid curiosity that makes you look at a car wreck as you drive past, or maybe it was something else. Something in that light that made me want to follow it, to understand what I was seeing. The lantern started moving again, drifting off to the right, toward the tree line. It moved slow, patient, like it knew I'd follow. And God help me, I did. I eased the truck forward, turning onto what wasn't even really a road, just two ruts in the mud, where maybe a logging truck had driven through years ago. The branches scraped against the sides of my truck, high and screeching, and I had to use my wipers to clear away the pine needles that kept falling on the windshield. The lantern stayed maybe 30 yards ahead, always just at the edge of my headlights, leading me deeper into the hollow. That's when I noticed how quiet everything had gotten. There should have been noise. Crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves, something. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my truck's engine and my own breathing, quick and shallow. Even the air felt different, heavier, like I was driving through water instead of fog. I could see my breath inside the cab now, little clouds that hung in the air longer than they should have. I'd been following for maybe 10 minutes when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from outside the truck to my left, pacing alongside me through the trees. Heavy boots in wet mud, the squelch and suck of someone walking through standing water. But I wasn't near any water. Miller's Hollow was dry this time of year. Hadn't rained in 2 weeks. I stopped the truck and rolled down my window, and that's when I realized the footsteps hadn't been matching my speed. They'd been getting closer. And now they were right next to my door. I couldn't see anyone. I leaned out the window, looking back along the tree line, and there was nothing but darkness and the fog creeping between the trunks, but I could still hear them, those footsteps, circling around the front of my truck now, slow and deliberate. The lantern had stopped too, hanging in the air about 15 feet ahead, and in its glow I could see the ground around it. The mud there was churned up, covered in prints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all leading in different directions, like a whole crowd of people had been walking in circles in that one spot. That's when I saw the face again. It was right in front of my truck, standing behind the lantern, and this time it was clear. It was a woman, I think, or had been once. Her face was gray, slack, the skin hanging loose like it didn't quite fit anymore. Her eyes were open but empty, just dark holes that went back and back into nothing. She was wearing a long dress, the kind with a high collar and long sleeves, all of it stained with something dark that might have been mud or might have been something worse. And she was smiling, not a happy smile, not a cruel one either. Just smiling like she was glad I'd come, like she'd been waiting for me. I threw the truck in reverse and floored it. The tires spun in the mud for a second that felt like an hour, and then they caught and I was flying backward, branches whipping across the windshield, the truck bouncing over roots and rocks. I didn't stop until I hit the main road again, didn't even look to see if anything was following me. When I finally got back on the pavement and turned the truck around, I sat there shaking, my hands cramped from gripping the wheel so hard. But I went back. I don't know why I went back. Maybe because I had to know what I'd seen was real, or maybe because part of me was still hearing those footsteps, still seeing that smile, and I needed to prove to myself that it was just my imagination, just the fog and the darkness playing tricks. I waited until the next night, told myself I'd just drive past, just check if the light was there again. I brought my hunting rifle, like that would make any difference. The light was there, same spot, same bone-white glow, swaying in the dark, and this time I wasn't alone. There were other vehicles parked along the road. Earl Hutchins' old pickup, a a car I didn't recognize, and what looked like Tommy Barker's four-wheeler ditched in the ditch. All of them empty, doors hanging open, keys still in the ignition. I pulled over and grabbed my rifle, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The lantern was moving again, drifting toward the trees, and I could see shapes following it. 3, maybe 4 people walking in single file, their movements slow and jerky like puppets on strings. I called out, told them to stop, asked if they were okay. None of them turned around. They just kept walking, following that cold light deeper into the hollow, their boots making that wet sucking sound in the mud that wasn't there. I followed them for about 100 yards before I lost my nerve. The forest was wrong in there. The trees were too close together, their branches twisted in ways that didn't make sense, and the ground was covered in standing water that reflected the lantern light like 100 broken mirrors. I could see faces in that water, old faces, young faces, faces I almost recognized from town. They were all looking up at me, all smiling that same empty smile. That's when I ran. I didn't care about the people I'd seen, didn't care about Earl or Tommy or whoever else had been stupid enough to follow the light. I just crashed back through the trees, fell twice, got back up, and kept running until I hit my truck. I drove home with the rifle in my lap and every light in my house on until sunrise. They found Earl's truck 3 days later, right where I'd seen it. No sign of Earl. Tommy Barker turned up a week after that, wandering out of Miller's Hollow without any memory of how he'd gotten there. He'd lost 30 pounds and his hair had gone white at the temples. He wouldn't talk about what happened, still won't to this day. Just stares out the window when you ask him, like he's looking for something he can't quite see. I moved away from Harlan 2 years later. Couldn't stand driving past Miller's Hollow anymore. Couldn't stand the way the mountains looked at me like they were waiting for me to come back. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I still hear them. Those footsteps in the mud, circling, getting closer. And I wonder if that woman with the empty eyes is still out there, holding her lantern, swaying in the dark, waiting for the next person curious enough or stupid enough to follow. I wonder if Earl is still walking behind her, and if Tommy remembers what it was like to be one of them, following that cold light into places the sun forgot. I wonder if I'm next, because sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that smile, and I think maybe part of me never really left Miller's Hollow at all. I was 12 when my brother Aaron first took me out to Chapman Bridge. It was late August, the kind of humid Appalachian evening where the air sits heavy on your chest and the cicadas scream so loud you can barely hear yourself think. Aaron was 16 then, old enough to drive Daddy's pickup if nobody asked too many questions about it, and he'd gotten it in his head that we needed to go skip rocks before summer ended proper. Chapman Bridge wasn't much to look at. Just old stone and timber spanning a narrow creek that fed into the Holston River. Locals called it the Widow's Crossing, though nobody I knew could tell you which widow or why. It was just one of those names that stuck to a place like moss on a gravestone. The bridge sat about 3 miles outside town, down a dirt road that wound through pine forest so thick the canopy blocked out half the sky. During the day, it was peaceful enough. Kids would fish off the banks. Teenagers would come out to drink and carve their initials into the bridge's weathered railings, but we'd never been there at night. Aaron parked the truck where the dirt road widened out near the tree line. The headlights caught the bridge for just a moment before he killed the engine. Old stone pillars holding up wooden planks that looked like they'd been there since before paved roads existed. The creek beneath it moved slow and black in the darkness, catching just enough moonlight to let you know it was there. "Come on," Aaron said, already out of the truck with a handful of flat stones he'd picked up from Mama's driveway. "Best skipping rocks in 3 counties right here." I followed him down to the creek bank, my sneakers squelching in the mud. The cicadas were even louder out here, joined by the steady trickle of water over rocks and the occasional bullfrog calling from somewhere downstream. Aaron sent his first stone flying. 1, 2, 3, 4 skips before it sank. He grinned at me, his teeth catching the moonlight. Beat that. I couldn't, of course. My stone plunked straight down after one sad bounce. We kept at it for a while, the comfortable silence between brothers who didn't need to fill every gap with words. The night felt normal. Good, even. Just 2 boys killing time by a creek the way boys had probably done at that same spot for 100 years. That's when we heard it. At first, I thought it was a fox or maybe a bobcat. There's a sound they make sometimes that's uncomfortably close to a woman screaming. But this wasn't quite that. It was crying, soft, muffled sobs that seemed to come from underneath the bridge itself. Aaron's hand froze mid-throw, his stone still clutched in his fist. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my throat suddenly too dry to speak. The crying continued, rising and falling like whoever was making it couldn't catch their breath. It echoed strangely off the stone pillars, making it impossible to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. "Probably just somebody's dog got loose," Aaron said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Or a coon. They make weird sounds." The crying hitched, then shifted. It wasn't just sobbing anymore. There were words in it now, too soft and distorted to make out. Aaron took a step toward the bridge. I grabbed his arm. "Don't." "It might be somebody hurt," he said, but he didn't pull away from my grip. We stood there frozen, listening. The words in the crying grew clearer, separated from the sobs like oil rising to the surface of water. It was a woman's voice, thin and desperate, and she was calling something. A name, maybe. The syllables were almost right there, just at the edge of understanding. And then my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Jacob. My name. Clear as church bells on Sunday morning. My name coming from underneath that bridge in a voice I'd never heard before, spoken so softly it should have been impossible to hear over the creek and the insects, but I heard it like she was whispering directly into my ear. "Jacob, please." Aaron's hand found mine in the dark and squeezed hard enough to hurt. "We're leaving," he said, his voice tight and high. "Now." We backed away from the creek, neither of us willing to turn our backs on that bridge. The crying followed us, growing louder as we retreated. Not just louder, closer, like whatever was making it had emerged from beneath those stones and was tracking us through the darkness. By the time we reached the truck, we were running. Aaron's hands shook so badly he dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. The engine turned over and Aaron threw it in reverse, spraying gravel as we fishtailed back toward the main road. I didn't look back at the bridge. I was too afraid of what I might see standing there in the red glow of the tail lights. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. Didn't talk about it when we pulled into our driveway and sat in the dark cab for 5 minutes, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Aaron finally broke the silence. "You tell anybody about this, they'll think we're crazy." "I know. I mean it, Jacob. Not even Mama." I nodded. We went inside and acted like we'd spent the evening doing exactly what we'd told our parents we were going to do. Hanging around town, maybe grabbing ice cream at the Dairy Queen. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? I tried to sleep that night but couldn't manage more than restless dozing. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again in my memory. That voice calling my name, the desperate, pleading quality of it. Around 2 in the morning, I finally gave up and lay there staring at my ceiling, watching the shadows cast by the oak tree outside my window shift in the breeze. That's when I heard the whispering. It was so faint at first I thought I was imagining it. Just a soft susurrus like wind through leaves, except my window was closed. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, definitely whispering, definitely coming from outside, coming from right outside my window. "Jacob." The same voice from the bridge. Soft and sad and calling my name like I was something precious she'd lost and desperately wanted back. I pulled my covers up to my chin like they could protect me, like I was 6 years old again and afraid of the dark. The whispering continued, circling my window, sometimes fading to nothing, sometimes clear enough that I could hear the wet sound of lips forming the syllables. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn finally broke and the whispering faded with the darkness, I crept downstairs to find Aaron already in the kitchen, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. He took one look at me and said, "You too?" The second night was worse. I tried to prepare myself. I kept my bedroom light on. I played music on my old stereo, loud enough that Mama yelled at me to turn it down. But when midnight rolled around, the whispering came back. This time it was louder, more insistent. My name repeated over and over like a prayer or an incantation. And underneath it, I could hear that crying again, that same desperate sobbing from the bridge. Aaron came into my room without knocking, his face pale. "It's outside my window too," he said. "Both sides of the house. How is it on both sides?" We spent that night together in my room, both of us sitting up with our backs against the wall, watching my window like it might explode inward at any moment. The whispering continued until dawn, sometimes fading to almost nothing, sometimes pressed so close to the glass that the window pane seemed to fog with breath we couldn't see. By the third night, we were strung out and exhausted, jumping at every sound. Daddy asked if we were coming down with something. Mama wanted to take our temperatures. We lied and said we were fine, just not sleeping well because of the heat. It was easier than trying to explain. I should have known the third night would be different. Should have felt it coming the way animals sense a storm, but I was too tired, too wrung out to pay attention to the prickle of dread working its way up my spine as the sun set. Aaron came to my room again as darkness fell. We didn't even discuss it anymore. We just sat together and waited. The whispering started earlier that night, not long after 10, but it wasn't whispering anymore, not really. It was breathing. Long, slow exhalations that fogged the glass of my window, leaving streaks of condensation that caught the lamplight. Breath that rattled slightly, like it was coming from lungs that didn't work quite right anymore. And underneath the breathing, I could hear words. Not whispered now, but spoken in a normal tone, as clear as if someone was sitting right there in the room with us. "I've been looking for you, Jacob. Looking for so long. Why did you leave me under the bridge? Why did everyone leave me there?" Aaron grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. The breathing continued, steady and wet against the window pane. And then, in the fogged glass, something began to appear. A shape. The outline of a hand, pressing against the window from outside. Fingers too long, joints bending in slightly wrong places. "Come back to the bridge, Jacob. Come back and help me up. The water's so cold down here. I've been cold for so long." The hand pressed harder, and I heard the window frame creak. Aaron was making a sound low in his throat, something between a whimper and a prayer. I couldn't move. Couldn't look away from that hand spreading its too long fingers against the glass. "Please, Jacob. Please come back." The breathing grew louder, more labored. The fog on the window spread until I could barely see through it. And then, slowly, another shape began to form in the condensation. A face, pressing close. I couldn't make out features, just the suggestion of eye sockets, a gaping mouth. The window creaked again, and a hairline crack appeared in one corner of the pane. That broke the paralysis. Aaron lunged forward and yanked the curtains closed, blocking out the sight. We could still hear it, though. That breathing, those words, that desperate pleading voice. It continued for hours, until the sky began to lighten with dawn. Only then did it fade, drawing back like a tide going out. Neither of us moved for a long time after it was gone. Finally, Aaron said, "We have to go back." "What?" "To the bridge. We have to go back and figure out what this is. It's not going to stop, Jacob. You know it's not going to stop." He was right, and I hated that he was right. So that afternoon, while our parents were at work, we drove back out to Chapman Bridge. In daylight, it looked harmless again, just an old bridge over a slow creek, nothing more. We parked and walked down to the water, both of us jumping at every sound. "Hello?" Aaron called out, his voice echoing off the stones. "Is somebody here?" Nothing answered. We circled the bridge, looking underneath it, searching the banks. There was nothing unusual. No evidence that anyone had been there. No sign of where that voice could have come from. "Maybe we should ask around town," I said, "about the Widow's Crossing, about why they call it that." We spent the rest of that day talking to anyone who would listen. Most people just shrugged or gave us the same vague story about some woman losing her husband a long time ago. But old Mr. Patterson, who'd lived in Chapman his whole life and was pushing 90, he told us something different. "The widow wasn't a wife," he said, rocking in his chair on the porch of the general store. "She was a mother, lost her boy to that creek back in the 20s. He fell through the ice during a hard winter, got swept under the bridge. They never found the body. She used to go out there every night and call for him, stood on that bridge until she caught pneumonia and died." "What was the boy's name?" Aaron asked, though from the look on his face, he already knew. "Jacob," Mr. Patterson said. "Jacob Brennan. Same last name as you boys' grandmother's people, if I recall. You might be kin." We drove home in silence. That night, the breathing didn't come back to my window. Neither did the whispering. Whatever had been looking for me, whatever piece of grief and loss had been calling my name, seemed to have given up. But sometimes, even now when I drive past that bridge, and I do drive past it, though I never stop, I hear it again, just for a moment, just long enough to make me press harder on the gas and check my rearview mirror, checking to see if something's following me home, checking to see if she's still looking for the boy she lost beneath those stones, still calling out his name into the darkness, hoping this time, finally, he'll answer. I've been driving long-haul deliveries through the Appalachians for close to 15 years now, and I've learned that some stretches of highway don't feel quite right after dark. There's this particular route that cuts through eastern Kentucky, winding through valleys so narrow the mountains seem to press in on both sides, and I used to take it twice a month back in 2019. The pay was decent, and the roads were usually empty enough that I could make good time. But after what happened that October, I requested a different route. My dispatcher didn't ask why, and I was grateful for that. It was a Thursday night, late in the month when the leaves had already turned and started falling. I'd left Lexington around 4 in the afternoon, planning to push through to Bristol by morning. But the delivery had taken longer than expected, and I'd gotten stuck behind a jackknifed semi for nearly 2 hours just outside Hazard. By the time I was moving again, it was past 11, and I was running on fumes, both the truck and myself. I'd been awake since 5 that morning, and my eyes were starting to do that thing where they drift closed for just a second before I jolt back awake. I knew I needed to stop, but this stretch of Route 119 didn't offer much in the way of accommodations. That's when I saw the sign for the Pinecrest Motor Lodge, one of those hand-painted wooden things that looked like it had been there since the 70s. The paint was flaking, and the light behind it was flickering, but it was a place to sleep, and that was all I cared about. I pulled off onto a gravel access road that curved back into a stand of old-growth pines, the kind that block out the moonlight and make everything underneath them feel like a basement. The parking lot was mostly empty, just an old Buick with a tarp over it and a pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The motel itself was a single-story L-shaped building, maybe 12 rooms total, with that yellowish exterior lighting that makes everything look jaundiced and sick. Most of the windows were dark. I grabbed my overnight bag and headed toward the office, which was tucked into the corner of the L. Inside, the air smelled like cigarette smoke and something else, something musty and organic, like wet leaves left to rot. There was a man behind the counter, maybe 60, with thin gray hair combed over a spotted scalp. He was reading a newspaper, the kind that's mostly classifieds and local obituaries, and he didn't look up when I walked in. The bell above the door had rung. I heard it myself. But he just kept reading, his finger slowly tracing down a column of text. "Excuse me," I said. "I need a room for the night." He still didn't look up, just reached under the counter and slid a key across the Formica surface. It was attached to a plastic diamond-shaped tag with the number 7 written in faded marker. There was no credit card machine, no register that I could see. Just a small metal cash box sitting beside a coffee mug filled with pens. "How much?" I asked. 30, he said quietly, still not raising his eyes from the paper. I put 2 20s on the counter. He didn't give me change, didn't ask me to sign anything. Just kept reading like I wasn't even there. I stood there for a moment, waiting for something. Instructions, a receipt, acknowledgement, but nothing came. Finally, I just took the key and left. Room 7 was at the far end of the building, the last door before the woods pressed up against the property line. The gravel lot gave way to dirt and pine needles just past the edge of the pavement, and when I looked out toward the tree line, I couldn't see more than 10 feet in. The fog had rolled in thick while I was inside, not the wispy kind that drifts, but the heavy, low-hanging type that seems to cling to everything. It moved between the trees like something alive, curling around the trunks and settling into the hollows. The room was what you'd expect, double bed with a floral comforter that had been washed so many times it felt like paper, a television bolted to a pressboard dresser, a bathroom with rust stains in the sink. There was a window that took up most of the wall facing the woods, with thin curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle. I thought about asking for a different room, one that didn't face all that darkness, but the idea of going back to that office and dealing with that clerk again made me more tired than I already was. I locked the door, checked it twice, and kicked off my boots. The bed groaned when I sat down on it. I thought about taking a shower, but decided against it. The bathroom had that feel to it, like the tiles had absorbed decades of other people's skin and breath, and I didn't want to stand in there any longer than necessary. Instead, I set my alarm for 6 and turned off the lights. The darkness in that room was total. The curtains were too thin to block out light, but somehow thick enough to block out any sense of what was beyond them. I could hear the wind moving through the pines, a sound like distant whispering, and somewhere farther off. Something that might have been an owl or might have been something else. I was nearly asleep when I heard the first tap. It was soft, almost polite, like someone knocking with one knuckle against the glass. Tap. Pause. Tap. Tap. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark shape of the window. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic, always the same pattern. Tap. Pause. Tap. Tap. I told myself it was a branch, even though I hadn't seen any trees close enough to reach the window. I told myself it was the wind, even though wind doesn't tap with such deliberate spacing. I lay there listening for maybe 2 minutes before I got up. My phone was on the nightstand, and I used its flashlight to cross the room, keeping the beam low so I wouldn't be backlit when I reached the window. My hand was shaking when I pulled the curtain back. There was a child standing outside. At least, that's what I thought at first. It was small, maybe the size of a 7 or 8-year-old, and pale. Not just white, but pale in a way that seemed to reflect what little light there was. It wasn't wearing shoes, and its feet were caked in mud that looked black in the darkness. Its arms hung at its sides, too long for its body, and its fingers seemed to reach almost to its knees. But it was the head that made me step back from the window. It was tilted, cocked at an angle, like a dog listening to a distant sound. But it was tilted too far, at an angle that would have snapped the neck of anything human. And it stayed that way, frozen in that position, while the tapping continued. I realized then that the tapping wasn't coming from its hands. They hadn't moved at all. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere lower, though I couldn't see what was making the sound. I stood there, my breath fogging the glass, and watched as the thing's head slowly rotated further, impossibly further, until it was nearly upside down. It was looking at me now, or at least I think it was. I couldn't make out features, just a pale oval where a face should have been. The tapping stopped. I dropped the curtain and backed away, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I found my phone and pulled up the dial screen, ready to call 911. But what would I even say? There's something outside my window that might be a child, but definitely isn't. I stood in the middle of that room, listening, waiting for the tapping to start again, or for a knock on the door, or for anything at all. But there was only silence. After what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes, I moved back to the window and looked out again. Nothing. Just the fog and the trees and the impenetrable darkness beyond. I checked the door lock again, pushed the dresser in front of it, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the bed with my back against the headboard and my phone's flashlight pointed at the window. Morning came slowly, the darkness giving way to a gray pre-dawn light that barely seemed brighter than the night. I hadn't slept at all. My alarm went off at 6 and I shut it off immediately, my whole body stiff from sitting upright for hours. I got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain back in the full light of day. The fog had lifted, and I could see the tree line clearly now, maybe 20 feet from the building. The ground between the window and the woods was dirt and pine needles, scattered with fallen leaves, and there, on the concrete windowsill just outside the glass, were muddy footprints. They were small, child-sized, and they were fresh. The mud was still wet in places. They led up to the window from the direction of the woods, a clear trail across the dirt. But that wasn't what made my hands start shaking again. It was the other set of prints, the ones that led away from the window. They didn't go back toward the woods. They went under the window, around the corner of the building, and ended at my door. I pressed my face to the glass and looked down. The prints were there on the concrete just outside, mud tracked across the threshold. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The door, which I had locked and barricaded with the dresser, had a gap at the bottom, maybe 2 inches of space. It would have been enough for water to flow under, enough for insects to crawl through, enough for something with fingers as long as I'd seen to reach inside. I looked down at the floor on my side of the door. The linoleum was old and stained, but in the morning light I could see it clearly. There were muddy prints on the floor inside my room. Not many, just a few, like something had tested the space, reached in and touched the floor just beyond the threshold. They led inward about a foot, then stopped, as though whatever had made them had decided not to come any further. I grabbed my bag and left without checking out, without even looking toward the office. I got in my truck and drove straight through to Bristol without stopping, without even slowing down except for the one stoplight in town. My dispatcher called around noon asking about the delivery, and I told him everything had gone fine, made my drop-off right on schedule. I didn't tell him about the Pinecrest Motor Lodge or what I'd seen outside my window. I didn't tell anyone for months. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through those mountains, I think about that thing standing outside the window, about how it tilted its head like it was listening through the glass, about how patient it was, how it tapped so politely, like it was asking permission. And I think about those footprints leading inside, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd fallen asleep, if I'd been lying there unconscious while something with 2 long arms and a head that bent the wrong way reached through that gap and touched my face with muddy fingers. I requested a different route after that, like I said. My new route takes me through Virginia instead, along bigger highways with better lighting and more traffic. It adds 3 hours to the drive and costs me money and fuel, but I don't care. Because there are some stretches of road in these mountains that don't feel right after dark, and there are some places where you shouldn't stop no matter how tired you are. And there are some things standing in the woods outside cheap motel rooms that know how to knock very politely. and that wait very patiently. And that can fit through spaces you'd never think to worry about. I don't drive through eastern Kentucky anymore, and I don't sleep in rooms that face the woods. That's when I heard it. A sound from somewhere behind me, back toward the church. Not loud, just the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel. I jerked my hand back from the grave and spun around, but there was nobody there. The cemetery was still empty, just rows of headstones and the white church building beyond them. But I could have sworn I'd heard someone walking. I stood up slowly, my hand covered in dark soil from the grave, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood go cold. My footprints were there in the mud, leading from the main path of the cemetery to where I was standing, clear as day, showing exactly where I'd walked. But there was another set too, right next to mine, matching my path step for step. Deeper prints, the same size as the ones leading from the church to the grave. Someone had been walking right beside me the whole time, and I hadn't seen them. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran out of that cemetery like the devil himself was on my heels, my shoes slipping in the mud, my heart trying to pound its way out of my chest. I didn't stop until I was back on the main road, bent over with my hands on my knees, gasping for air and trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But I couldn't explain away those footprints. Couldn't explain how dry that grave had been or the silence that had pressed down on me like a physical weight. And I sure as hell couldn't explain that sound I'd heard. Those footsteps that had come from somewhere behind me when I knew I was alone. I called in sick to work. Went home and tried to forget about it, tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. But that night I lay in bed and all I could think about was that grave, and those footprints, and the way the air had felt wrong around that plot of bare earth. Around midnight I gave up on sleep and got up to get some water. The house was dark and quiet, everyone else asleep. I was standing at the kitchen sink filling a glass when I looked out the window toward town. From our house, up on the hillside, you can see the church steeple rising above the trees. And beyond it, just barely visible in the moonlight, the cemetery. There was someone standing in it. I couldn't make out details from that distance, but I could see the silhouette, perfectly still among the headstones, standing right about where that unmarked grave would be. I watched for maybe 5 minutes, the water glass forgotten in my hand, ice-cold fear spreading through my chest. The figure never moved. Didn't shift position, didn't walk, just stood there in the moonlight like a sentinel, or like someone keeping watch over something they couldn't leave. When I finally blinked and looked again, it was gone. The cemetery was empty, just shadows and stone and that one patch of dark earth that wouldn't settle. I moved away for college the next year, got a job in Lexington. Didn't come back to Harlan County much except for holidays. But I heard from my mom that Reverend Caldwell died a few years ago, and the church brought in a new young preacher from somewhere down in Tennessee. He decided the cemetery needed cleaning up, wanted to mark all the graves properly, even the old ones nobody remembered anymore. They say he tried to put a stone on that unmarked plot, had it made up, just a simple marker that said, "Unknown, may he rest in peace," with the date they thought the man had been buried. But they couldn't get the stone to stay upright. It would fall over within a day, no matter how deep they set it, or how they tried to secure it. Finally, the preacher gave up, said, maybe some graves weren't meant to be marked. My mom told me this last Christmas, mentioned it casually over dinner like it was just local gossip. But I saw the look in her eyes, the same look I'd seen in Grandpa's all those years ago when he first told me about that grave. Some things, that look said, some things just aren't right, and all you can do is accept it and stay away. I haven't been back to that cemetery since the day I saw those footprints. Don't plan to either. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that plot of dark earth that won't settle. Think about whoever's down there and why the ground won't have him. Think about those footprints appearing out of nowhere and the way that grave stays firm and fresh no matter how much time passes. And I wonder if maybe the earth isn't refusing to take him. Maybe it's refusing to let him go. Maybe whatever's buried there is supposed to stay down, and that firm packed soil is the only thing keeping him there. Maybe that's why it never settles, never softens, never lets anything grow. I was maybe 10 years old the first time my grandfather told me about the grave that wouldn't settle. We were sitting on his back porch in Harlan County, watching the rain come down in sheets, the kind of downpour that turns dirt roads into rivers and makes the whole holler smell like wet earth and rotting leaves. He'd been quiet for a long while, just rocking in that old chair of his, when he finally spoke up without looking at me. "You know that plot behind the Free Will Baptist Church?" he asked. "The one with no stone?" I nodded. Every kid in town knew about it. It was tucked away in the far corner of the cemetery, past all the nice rows of headstones with their plastic flowers and American flags. Just a rectangle of bare ground that never grew anything, not even weeds. We used to dare each other to touch it, the way kids do with anything that feels wrong. "That's been there since before I was born," Grandpa continued, still not looking at me. "Man died back in the 20s, they say. Nobody came to claim him. Nobody even knew his real name. Sheriff found him in a hunting cabin up on Briar Ridge, been dead maybe 3 weeks. Summer heat had gotten to him pretty bad. He paused to spit tobacco juice into an old coffee can. They buried him behind the church because the regular cemetery wouldn't take him. Said he hadn't been baptized, hadn't attended services. Truth was, nobody wanted him there. Something about him made folks uneasy, even dead." Grandpa finally turned to look at me then, his eyes serious in a way I wasn't used to seeing. "Graves settle, boy. Rain comes, ground gets soft, everything sinks down a little. That's just how it works. But that grave, it's been firm as concrete for near about 100 years. Like the earth won't have him." I didn't think much about that conversation for years. It was just another one of Grandpa's stories, the kind of thing old folks in Appalachia tell to pass the time and spook the young ones. But the grave stayed in the back of my mind, the way certain things do when you're a kid. Every time we'd play near the church, I'd glance over at that bare patch of ground, and sometimes I swear I could feel it looking back. The summer I turned 17, me and my friend Travis started cutting through the cemetery on our way home from our shifts at the Dollar General. It was quicker than taking the main road, and in those hills, you learn to appreciate shortcuts. Travis would usually light up a cigarette once we hit the church property, figuring God wouldn't mind too much if we were just passing through. It was on one of those walks, maybe mid-July, when Travis stopped dead in his tracks and pointed at the unmarked grave. "You ever notice how that dirt looks fresh?" he said, "like someone just filled it in yesterday." He was right. While all the other graves had grass growing over them, some so old they were barely visible as mounds anymore, this one looked like someone had just finished packing it down with a shovel. The soil was dark and even, the edges crisp against the surrounding grass. "My grandpa says it's been like that forever," I told him. "That's bullshit," Travis said, but he didn't sound convinced. He took a drag off his cigarette and stared at the plot for a long moment. "You think someone's been tending it? Like maintaining it? Who'd maintain a grave with no marker? For someone nobody even knew?" Travis didn't have an answer for that. We stood there for a few minutes, both of us looking at that rectangle of dark earth, before he finally flicked his cigarette away and we kept walking. But after that day, I started paying more attention to the grave. Started noticing things, like how it was always the same. Other graves would sprout dandelions in the spring. Their grass would grow long and need trimming. They'd settle after heavy rains and their markers would tilt over the years, but that unnamed plot never changed. It was always the same dark soil, packed firm, perfectly level. And more than that, there was something about the air around it. A stillness that didn't feel natural, like that spot existed in its own separate pocket of time. The older folks at the church didn't like to talk about it. I tried asking Reverend Caldwell once, when I helped him carry some boxes of hymnals into the storage room. He got quiet for a moment, then just shook his head. "Some things are better left alone, son," he said. "That ground's been troubled for longer than I've been alive. Nothing good comes from paying it attention." But I couldn't leave it alone. Maybe it was teenage stubbornness, or maybe something about that grave had gotten under my skin the same way it seemed to bother the earth itself. I started walking through the cemetery more often, even when it wasn't on my way. I'd find excuses to cut through there, always slowing down when I passed that plot, studying it like it might give up its secrets if I just looked hard enough. It was late August when the storm came through. Not a hurricane, we don't get those this far inland, but one of those Appalachian thunderstorms that makes you understand why folks used to think the mountains were angry. The sky turned green around dusk, and then the rain came down so hard you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. Lightning struck somewhere close enough that I felt the thunder in my chest. Power went out around 8, and I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, listening to the storm tear through the holler. By morning, the rain had stopped, but everything was soaked. Tree branches down everywhere, the creek risen up muddy and fast, water standing in every low spot. I had to work the afternoon shift, so I spent the morning helping my dad clear debris from our driveway. Around noon, I grabbed my jacket and headed out early, planning to walk through town, maybe grab something to eat before my shift started. I don't know why I decided to cut through the cemetery. It was muddy as hell, and I knew my shoes would be caked with red clay by the time I got through. But something pulled me that direction, the same way you might prod at a sore tooth with your tongue even though you know it's going to hurt. The cemetery was a mess. The storm had knocked over several of the older headstones, and there were puddles everywhere between the graves. In spots, you could see where the ground had washed away, exposing the edges of old caskets that had been there so long the wood had turned to something like stone. Some of the newer graves had sunk down noticeably, the way Grandpa always said they would, leaving depressions in the earth that had filled with rainwater. But when I got to the back corner, to that unmarked plot, it was exactly the same as always. The soil was dark and firm, perfectly level, not a puddle in sight. While every other grave in that cemetery showed the effects of the storm, this one looked untouched, like the rain had just avoided it entirely. I stood there staring at it, that feeling of wrongness settling over me like a cold blanket. The air around the grave felt different, heavier somehow, and there was no sound, no birds, no insects, nothing. Just silence pressing in from all sides. That's when I saw the footprints. They led up to the grave from the direction of the church, clear as day in the mud. Boot prints, bigger than mine, the tread still visible in the soft earth. They walked right up to the edge of that plot and stopped. Just stopped, like whoever made them had been standing there, looking down at the grave the same way I was now. My heart was hammering as I looked around. But I was alone. The cemetery was empty except for the crows calling from the trees on the far side. I looked back at the footprints, following them with my eyes, from the church to the grave. And that's when my stomach dropped. There were prints leading away too, but they didn't go back the way they'd come. They went in the opposite direction, toward the woods at the back of the cemetery. And about halfway to the tree line, they were joined by a second set of prints. Smaller, lighter, the impressions not as deep, like someone who weighed less or walked more carefully, or like something that didn't weigh what it should have. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't stop myself from walking closer, from crouching down at the edge of the grave to look at those footprints more carefully. The first set was easy enough to explain. Someone had come to check on the cemetery after the storm, maybe Reverend Caldwell or one of the church deacons. But those second prints, the ones that appeared out of nowhere halfway between the grave and the woods. I reached out without thinking and put my hand on the soil of the grave itself. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for it to be wet or soft, or to feel somehow wrong, but it just felt like dirt. firm, slightly cool, completely dry despite the rain that had fallen all night. I pressed down on it, trying to test how solid it was, and it didn't give at all. It was like pressing on concrete. Maybe that grave isn't firm because the earth won't have him. Maybe it's firm because he's still trying to get out. I was 16 when I first heard about the old quarry outside Boone. My uncle mentioned it once while we were sitting on his porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl. He said a man had gone missing there back in the 70s. Some worker who'd been breaking rock one minute and just gone the next. They searched for 3 days straight, he told me, combing every ledge and crevice, dragging the water at the bottom with hooks and chains. Never found a thing. Not a boot, not a tool, not a single trace. After that, the company pulled out and left it all behind. The equipment, the shacks, everything. Said it wasn't worth the trouble. But my uncle, he leaned in close when he told me this part, his voice dropping low. He said folks around here knew better. Said that quarry had a way of keeping what it took. I didn't think much about it at the time. Just another ghost story from the mountains, the kind old-timers tell to keep kids from wandering too far. But then I turned 19, moved into a cabin up near Meat Camp with my girlfriend Sarah, and I got it in my head that I wanted to start foraging. I'd read about it online, watched videos of people finding morels and chicken of the woods, making a living off what grew wild. Seemed like a good way to make ends meet while I figured out what I was doing with my life. Sarah thought it was a dumb idea, but she didn't say much. She rarely did by then. That spring was wet and cool, perfect conditions for mushrooms. I'd been going out most mornings, hiking the ridges and valleys with a canvas bag and a knife. I'd had some luck too, found a few patches of oysters, some decent chanterelles. But I kept hearing about this one spot from a guy at the farmer's market. Said there was a clearing near the old quarry, where the ground was just right, where mushrooms came up thick as carpet after a rain. He drew me a rough map on the back of a receipt, told me to go early, before the sun burned off the dew. So I did. I left the cabin before first light, drove my truck down the rutted Forest Service road until it dead-ended at a chain strung between two posts. I parked there and walked the rest of the way, following the map as best I could. The trail was overgrown, barely visible in places, and I had to push through tangles of briars and ivy that tore at my jacket. The woods were quiet that morning. Too quiet. No birds. No rustling in the underbrush. Just the sound of my boots on wet leaves and my own breathing. It took me about 40 minutes to reach the quarry. I came out of the trees onto a ridge, and there it was below me, this massive, gouged-out pit in the earth. Walls of grey stone dropping straight down, maybe 60, 70 feet. At the bottom was water, dark and still, surrounded by chunks of broken rock and the rusted skeletons of old machinery. There were a couple of shacks still standing at the far end, their roofs caved in and walls sagging. The whole place had this feeling to it, like I was looking at something that had been forgotten on purpose, left to rot where no one would have to think about it. I stood there for a minute, just taking it in. Then I noticed the fog. It was creeping up from the bottom of the quarry, rolling over the edges in thick white waves. I'd seen morning fog before, plenty of times, but this was different. It moved wrong, too slow and deliberate, like it had weight to it. And it didn't dissipate as it rose. It just kept coming, spilling over the rim and spreading across the ground, swallowing the scrub brush and saplings. Within minutes, it had surrounded me, pressing in so close I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I should have left then. I knew it in my gut. But I'd come all this way, and I hadn't found a single mushroom yet. So I started working my way along the ridge, eyes on the ground, looking for the telltale shapes pushing up through the leaf litter. The fog thickened as I went, and I had to move slowly, testing each step before I put my weight down. The edge of the quarry was close, somewhere off to my left, and I didn't want to get disoriented and walk right off the damn cliff. That's when I heard it. A cough. wet and ragged, like someone trying to clear fluid from their lungs. It echoed up from the bottom of the quarry, bouncing off the stone walls. I stopped walking, held my breath, listened. For a few seconds there was nothing. Then it came again, that same thick, labored sound. And this time I heard something else underneath it, a scraping like boots dragging across rock. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed almost immediately by the fog. "Someone down there?" No answer. It was just the echo of my own words fading into nothing. I moved closer to the edge, peering down into the white. I couldn't see anything, just more fog, dense and unmoving, but I could feel something looking back at me. I don't know how to explain it better than that. It was like the air itself had eyes. Then I saw the figure. It was standing at the bottom of the quarry, half hidden in the mist. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape, human-sized, absolutely still. And then it moved, raised one arm slowly, deliberately, and waved at me. Not a friendly wave, not a call for help, just a slow, mechanical gesture, back and forth, like someone imitating what they thought a wave should look like. My throat went dry. "You okay?" I shouted down. "You need help?" For a moment, nothing. Then the figure took a step forward into a slightly thinner patch of fog, and I could see it better. It was wearing work clothes, old denim and a flannel shirt, both dark with moisture. The face was pale, too pale, and tilted up toward me at an angle that didn't look right. And it waved again, that same slow, unnatural motion. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. "Can you hear me?" And then it answered. "Can you hear me?" The voice drifted up through the fog, distorted and hollow, but unmistakably my own, my exact words, my exact cadence, but slower, stretched out like they'd been recorded and played back at the wrong speed. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't someone mocking me. This wasn't an echo. This was something repeating what I'd said, shaping the sounds with a mouth that maybe didn't understand how to use it properly. "What the hell?" I whispered, more to myself than anything. "What the hell?" it said back, quieter now, almost thoughtful. The figure stood there, unmoving except for that arm still waving back and forth, back and forth. I backed away from the edge, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fog seemed to thicken around me, pressing closer, and suddenly I couldn't tell which direction I'd come from. The trees all looked the same, gray and indistinct through the white. I picked a direction and started walking fast, almost jogging, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was down in that quarry. Behind me, I heard it again, that wet, gurgling cough. And then my own voice, calling out from the fog, "You okay? You need help?" The same words I'd shouted down, repeated perfectly, but wrong somehow, like they were coming from a throat that had been underwater too long. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping across my face, not caring about the noise I was making or where I was going, just focused on getting away. The fog followed me, or at least it felt like it did. Thick tendrils curling around tree trunks, reaching for me. I could hear footsteps somewhere behind me, slow and heavy, crunching through the leaves, and that voice, my voice, calling out random phrases I'd said, mixing them together. "Hello, someone down there, you okay? Hello, what the hell, can you hear me?" I don't know how long I ran. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been 20. Eventually I broke out of the fog and found myself on the trail, gasping for air, my legs shaking. I looked back and the white wall was still there, roiling at the edge of the trees like it was alive, but it didn't follow me any further. I stood there for a long moment, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. Then I heard it one more time, distant now, barely audible. "You need help." My voice. Coming from deep in the fog, and underneath it, that terrible wet cough, rattling and endless. I walked back to my truck, drove home. Didn't say anything to Sarah when I got there, just took a long shower and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. And when I looked up the quarry later that day, searching through old newspaper archives at the library, I found the article about the missing worker. His name was Dale Pritchard. He'd been breaking rock near the bottom of the pit when the walls had shifted, they said. Probably buried under tons of rubble. They'd pumped out the water, searched for weeks, but the article mentioned something else too. Something I'd missed when my uncle told me the story. In the days after Dale disappeared, other workers reported hearing things. Voices calling out from the bottom of the quarry. One man said he heard someone repeating his words back to him, asking him to come down and help. They all thought it was Dale, trapped somewhere they couldn't reach. But then they'd see him, or think they saw him, standing in the mist at the bottom, waving up at them. And when they'd try to climb down to reach him, they'd lose sight of him in the fog, wander around the pit floor for hours before finding their way back up. One guy broke his legs stumbling over rocks, said he'd been following Dale's voice the whole time, sure he was just ahead of him, just out of sight. After that, the company shut it all down, said it was too dangerous. But the article ended with a quote from one of the workers, a man named Russell Cobb. He said something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That ain't Dale down there. Dale's gone. Whatever's wearing his shape, using his voice, that's something the mountain made to fill the empty space he left behind. I never went back to the quarry. Never tried foraging again either. Sarah and I broke up a few months later and I moved back to town, got a job at the hardware store. But sometimes on foggy mornings, I'll be walking to my car or taking out the trash and I'll hear it. Faint and far away, but unmistakable. My own voice, calling out from somewhere I can't see, asking if anyone needs help. And I know deep in my bones that if I ever answered, if I ever followed that sound back to where it came from, I'd find myself standing at the edge of that quarry again, looking down into the white, watching something wave up at me from the bottom. Something that's been waiting down there for 50 years, patient and hungry, practicing the sounds it needs to make to bring someone close enough to touch. So I don't answer. I go inside, I lock the door, and I try not to think about what might happen if the fog ever gets thick enough, close enough, that I can't tell the difference between my own voice and the one calling my name. I inherited the radio 3 weeks after my father's funeral. It came in a cardboard box with some of his other things. A pocket watch that didn't work, a Bible with water-stained pages, and the shortwave radio he'd kept in his workshop for as long as I could remember. The thing was ancient, heavy as a cinder block, with a cracked dial face and a veneer of wood paneling that had warped and split over the years. My mother told me he'd bought it at an estate sale back in the 70s before I was born, and that he used to listen to it every night before bed. She said it like it was something sweet, but I remembered it differently. I remembered being a kid and hearing that radio crackling through the walls at 2, 3 in the morning, my father's low voice sometimes talking back to whatever he was hearing. I never asked him about it. Some things you just don't ask. I kept it on my kitchen counter for the first week, just looking at it. I'd moved into a rental house at the edge of Boone after the divorce, a place where the nearest neighbor was a quarter mile through the woods. The isolation suited me. I worked from home doing data entry, and most days I didn't talk to another living soul. The radio sat there collecting dust until one night when the power went out during a storm. I lit some candles and sat in the quiet for a while, listening to the rain hammer the roof, and I got curious. I plugged the radio into the wall socket when the power came back on, half expecting it not to work at all. It crackled to life immediately, that warm orange glow behind the dial, and I started turning the knob. Static, mostly, the way you'd expect, but then I'd catch fragments. A preacher shouting about salvation, a weather report in Spanish, what sounded like old country music played on a distant AM station. There was something comforting about it, the way those voices reached out across the dark. I started making it a habit, tuning in every night after I finished work, sitting at the kitchen table with a beer and just listening. Sometimes I wouldn't even pay attention to what was being said. It was just company, I guess. The sound of other people existing somewhere out there. About 2 weeks in, I found a frequency I hadn't noticed before. It was somewhere around 7.2 megahertz, a spot where I usually just got static, but that night there was something else. A whisper, so faint I thought I was imagining it at first. I leaned closer, turning up the volume, and the whisper got a little clearer. It sounded like someone speaking very quietly, very deliberately, but I couldn't make out the words. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes just listening to that soft murmur beneath the static, trying to parse meaning from it. Then, clear as anything, I heard my name. David. I jerked back from the radio so hard my chair scraped against the linoleum. The whisper continued, still soft, still barely audible. But now I couldn't unhear it. It was saying my name over and over, each repetition slightly different in inflection. David, David, David. I stared at the radio, my heart pounding in my ears, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was interference from a CB radio, someone with the same name, some weird coincidence. But the way it was said, it felt directed. It felt personal. I reached out and changed the frequency, twisting the dial to a news station. A woman's voice came through talking about traffic in Charlotte. Normal. Safe. I sat there listening to her for a few minutes, willing my heartbeat to slow down, telling myself I was being ridiculous. After a while, I turned the radio off and went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about that whisper, the way it had curled around my name like something tasting it. The next night, I told myself I wouldn't tune back to that frequency. I'd just listen to the regular stations, maybe find a ball game or a late-night talk show. But curiosity is a wicked thing, and around midnight, I found my hand drifting to the dial, sliding it back to 7.2 megahertz. The whisper was there immediately, louder this time, clearer. David is sitting at the kitchen table. David is wearing a gray t-shirt. David is drinking a Budweiser. I looked down at myself. Gray t-shirt. Budweiser in my hand. The can slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the table, foam hissing out of the opening. The voice continued, still that same soft whisper, still almost drowned out by static but unmistakably there. David is afraid now. David's hands are shaking. They were. I gripped the edge of the table and stared at the radio, at that orange glow behind the cracked dial face. "Who is this?" I said out loud, my voice hoarse. The whisper didn't acknowledge my question. It just kept going. "David is speaking. David wants to know who this is." I lunged forward and yanked the power cord out of the wall socket. The orange glow died immediately, the whisper cutting off mid-word. I sat there in the sudden silence, breathing hard, waiting for my rational mind to catch up with my fear. It was just some sick prank. Had to be. Someone was watching the house, maybe had cameras set up. Some elaborate joke or harassment. But even as I thought it, I knew how thin that explanation was. I lived at the end of a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. There were no street lights, no other houses with a clear line of sight to my windows. I stood up and went around the house, checking every window, every door, turning on all the lights. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no cameras that I could see, no indication anyone had been there. I even went outside with a flashlight and walked the perimeter of the house, my breath fogging in the cold October air, but there was nothing. Just the dark woods pressing in on all sides and the wind moving through the branches. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the couch with a baseball bat across my lap, jumping at every creak and settling sound the house made. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the windows, I felt foolish. In the daylight, the whole thing seemed less real, more like a bad dream. I made coffee and tried to work, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept looking at the radio on the kitchen counter, that dead black eye of the speaker grill staring back at me. That afternoon, I called my mother. I asked her about the radio, whether my father had ever said anything strange about it, whether he'd ever mentioned hearing anything unusual. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Why are you asking about that?" she said finally. "Just curious. He listened to it a lot, didn't he?" Another pause. "Towards the end, yes. He'd be up all hours with that thing, talking to it sometimes like he was having a conversation." She sighed. "I thought it was the dementia. The doctors said it was normal, that kind of confusion. I tried to get him to throw it out, but he wouldn't let me near it. My father had died of early onset Alzheimer's. He'd been diagnosed at 62, gone by 65. The last year had been bad, my mother said. He didn't recognize her half the time, thought he was back in Vietnam, kept talking about people who weren't there. I'd only visited once during that last year. I couldn't handle seeing him that way, and I've carried the guilt of that ever since." "Did he ever say what he was hearing?" I asked. "No, baby. Just static, I imagine. White noise." His mind filling in the gaps. She paused. "You getting rid of it?" "Maybe," I said. "Good," she said. "Nothing good in holding on to those things." I hung up and looked at the radio again. I should have listened to her. I should have taken it to the dump that afternoon, or smashed it with a hammer, or thrown it in the woods. But I didn't, because part of me needed to know. Part of me needed to understand what my father had been hearing all those nights, what had kept him up talking to the dark. I waited until after midnight. I don't know why. It felt like something that could only happen in the deep night, when the world was asleep and the barrier between normal and not normal was thinner. I plugged the radio back in, and my hands were steady this time. I was ready for it. I turned it on and went straight to 7.2 megahertz. The whisper was already there, waiting. David has been thinking about this all day. David is scared, but David is curious. David plugged the radio back in at 12:17 a.m. I checked my watch. 12:17. Exactly. "What do you want?" I said. "David is asking what we want. David thinks there is something to want." "We." It said we. "Who are you?" My voice was shaking now, despite my best efforts. David's father used to ask the same questions. David's father listened for 3 years before he understood. I felt something cold slide down my spine. Understood what? The whisper went quiet for a moment, and in that silence I could hear something else beneath the static. Voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all whispering at once, creating a sound like wind through leaves or water over stones. Then the single voice emerged again from that chorus. That we are always here, that we are always watching, that the frequency never ends, David. It just gets clearer. I stared at the radio. My father had Alzheimer's. He was sick. David's father was opening. David's father was learning to hear us without the radio. That is what David calls sickness. "No," I said. "No, that's not." David is standing now. David is backing away from the table. David is thinking about unplugging the radio again. I froze. I hadn't moved. I'd thought about it, felt the impulse to run, but I was still sitting down, still facing the radio. David is confused. David does not understand that we hear him thinking. We hear all of it, David. Every thought is a frequency. Every fear is a signal. Your father learned this. Your father stopped needing the radio to hear us. You will too. I yanked the cord out of the wall again, but this time the voice didn't stop. It kept going, muffled now, like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. I could hear it coming from the radios, even though the radio was dead. No power, no light. The whisper emanated from the speaker, like breath. David has unplugged the radio, but David can still hear us. David is realizing now. David is understanding. I grabbed the radio and threw it against the wall as hard as I could. The wooden cabinet cracked, pieces of veneer scattering across the floor, but the speaker remained intact, and the voice continued, quieter now, but still there. David broke the radio. David thinks this will help. David is wrong. I ran out of the kitchen, into my bedroom, and slammed the door. I could still hear it, that soft whisper threading through the walls, through the floor, through the air itself. I put my hands over my ears, and it didn't matter. The voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was in my head. David is in his bedroom. David has his hands over his ears. David is crying now. I was. I didn't realize I was until the voice said it, but tears were running down my face and my whole body was shaking. David's father cried too, at first, but David's father learned to listen. David's father learned that we are not cruel. We are only here. We have always been here. We are the voice in the static between thoughts. We are what people hear in empty rooms. We are why the silence is never truly silent. I don't know how long I sat there on the floor of my bedroom, hands pressed against my ears, while that voice described everything I did, everything I thought, everything I felt. At some point, the sun came up. At some point, I realized I was whispering back to it, answering questions it hadn't asked, having a conversation with the thing that was no longer just in the radio. My mother called me around noon. I didn't answer. She called again an hour later, and I picked up because the voice told me I was going to. "David," she said, "are you all right?" "You sound strange." "I'm fine," I heard myself say, though I don't remember deciding to speak those words. "Did you get rid of that radio?" I looked at the broken pieces of it still scattered across my kitchen floor. "Yes," I said. "It's gone." But I was lying. It wasn't gone at all. It had just changed frequencies. And now, like my father before me, I was learning to tune in without needing the dial. I was learning that the voice had always been there, underneath everything, waiting for someone to listen closely enough. We talked about the weather for a few minutes, my mother and I, normal things, safe things, but the whole time there was another conversation happening underneath. The voice describing what I was doing, what I was thinking, what I was becoming. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up at night now, sitting in the dark, listening, is that I'm starting to hear other voices too, different frequencies, different watchers, and I'm beginning to understand what my father understood in those final years. That we are never alone. That silence is a lie. That once you learn to hear them, they never stop talking. I don't remember exactly when I stopped believing in coincidence, but I know it was somewhere on Gallows Hill Road, probably around the time I realized the man sitting next to me had never opened the car door. This was back in October of 2019. I'd been working late at the plant in Moorfield, third shift maintenance, and I was driving back to my place in Lost River. Normally, I'd take Route 55 south and cut through the valley. But that night, there'd been an accident near the trough. Some logging truck had jackknifed and took out a power line. The detour sign sent everyone east, but I knew these mountains well enough. I'd grown up in these hollows. My grandfather used to say that if you knew the back roads, you could get anywhere in Grant County without ever seeing another soul. That's what I was thinking when I turned onto Gallows Hill Road. I could shave 20 minutes off the detour, maybe more. The storm had been building all evening, one of those late autumn tempests that come rolling down from the Alleghenies like something angry and alive. By the time I made the turn, the rain was coming down so hard my wipers could barely keep up, even on the highest setting. The road narrowed almost immediately, hemmed in by trees that seemed to lean closer in the dark, their branches scraping against each other in the wind. I'd driven Gallows Hill Road maybe twice before, always in daylight. It's one of those routes that doesn't really go anywhere useful, just connects a handful of old homesteads and hunting camps scattered back in the hills. Most of the families that lived out there had moved away years ago, after the mines closed. The road itself is barely maintained, more gravel than asphalt, with potholes deep enough to swallow a tire. But I figured in weather like this, anything was better than sitting in traffic. The name always bothered me, even as a kid. Gallows Hill. My grandfather told me once that back in the 1800s, they used to hang horse thieves from an oak tree at the top of the ridge. Said the tree was still there, lightning struck and dead, but still standing. He also said that people had a habit of disappearing on that road, though he never elaborated. Just gave me that look he had, the one that meant some stories were better left alone. I was maybe 3 miles in when my headlights caught something in the road. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was tall, dark, standing right in the middle of my lane. I hit the brakes and felt the car slide a little on the wet gravel before the ABS kicked in. The wipers swept across the windshield, and for just a second, the glass cleared enough for me to see. It was a man. He stood perfectly still in the rain, facing my car. Tall, probably 6'3" or 6'4", and thin in a way that didn't look quite right, like his proportions were slightly off. He was soaked through, his clothes plastered to his frame. Dark pants, dark jacket, no hat, no umbrella. Just standing there in the downpour like he'd been waiting for me. And he was smiling. Even through the rain and the distance, I could see that smile. Too wide, too fixed. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, though I couldn't really see his eyes from where I sat. Just that grin, white and constant. My first thought was that he needed help. Maybe his car had broken down, or he'd been in an accident. People died of exposure in weather like this, and we were miles from anything. I couldn't just leave him there. I shifted into park and reached for my phone, thinking I'd call it in, but there was no signal. Not surprising, cell service out here was spotty at best. The rain hammered on the roof, loud enough that I had to raise my voice when I leaned toward the window. "You okay?" I shouted, though I'm not sure he could have heard me. He didn't move, didn't nod or gesture or give any indication he'd heard me at all. Just stood there, rain streaming down his face, smiling that terrible smile. Something in my gut twisted. That old animal instinct, the one that whispers when something isn't right. But I ignored it. I told myself he was in shock, hypothermic maybe. I'd pulled people out of worse situations during my time with the volunteer fire department. This was just another emergency. I popped the door handle and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me immediately, rain like needles against my face and hands. I had to squint to see through it, and I remember taking 3, maybe 4 steps toward the front of the car before I realized he wasn't there anymore. The road was empty. I froze, water already soaking through my jacket. My headlights cut 2 pale tunnels through the darkness and rain, illuminating nothing but wet gravel and the skeletal shapes of trees. The man was gone. Completely gone. Like he'd never been there at all. "Hello," I called out, spinning around, checking the ditches on either side of the road. The forest pressed close here, thick with undergrowth and mountain laurel. He could have stepped into the trees, but I would have heard it. Branches breaking, leaves rustling. Something. There was nothing. Just the hiss of rain and the low moan of wind through the hollow. That's when I heard my car door slam shut. I whipped around. Through the rain-streaked driver's side window, I could see the interior light was off. The door was closed, and in the passenger seat, silhouetted against the faint glow of the dashboard, sat the man from the road. My blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. I didn't walk back to the car. I ran. My boots slipped on the gravel and I nearly went down, but I caught myself and yanked the driver's door open. The interior light came on, and I got my first clear look at him. He was still smiling. Up close, it was worse. Much worse. His lips were pulled back too far, showing too many teeth, and there was something wrong with the angle of it, like his mouth didn't quite work the way a mouth should. His skin was pale, fish belly white, and covered in a sheen of rainwater that caught the light in strange ways. His hair was plastered to his skull, dark and lank, but it was his eyes that stopped me. They were too large, too dark, and they didn't blink, not once, just stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "What the hell?" I started, but he moved before I could finish. He turned his head. Slowly, unnaturally slowly, like his neck was on a swivel. The movement was so deliberate, so wrong, that every instinct I had screamed at me to run. But I was standing in the open door of my own car, and he was sitting in the passenger seat like he belonged there. His smile never wavered. "Wrong way home," he whispered. His voice was thin and dry, like wind through dead leaves. It didn't sound like it was coming from his mouth. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere behind him or inside the car itself. The words seemed to echo in the small space, repeating themselves in my head even after he'd stopped speaking. "Wrong way home. Wrong way home." I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. It could have been seconds. It could have been longer. The rain soaked through my clothes and ran down my neck, and I just stared at this thing that looked like a man, but moved like something else entirely. "Get out," I finally managed. My voice cracked. "Get out of my car." He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge I'd spoken, just kept staring at me with those two large eyes, that awful smile stretched across his face. I reached for him. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I was going to grab his arm, pull him out physically. But the moment my hand got close, he spoke again. "Wrong way." This time his voice was louder, more insistent, and the temperature inside the car dropped. I felt it like a physical thing, a wave of cold that made my breath come out in clouds. The windows started to fog from the inside, condensation spreading across the glass in patterns that looked almost like frost. That's when I realized I could see through him, just slightly, just enough to make out the outline of the seat back behind his shoulder. I stumbled backward, and my hip hit the door frame hard enough to bruise. I didn't care. I was moving on pure instinct now, some primal part of my brain taking over. I slammed the driver's door shut and backed away from the car, rain hammering down on me, and I watched through the windshield as the man, the thing, sat perfectly still in the passenger seat. He was still smiling. I should have run, should have headed back down the road on foot, storm or no storm. But my keys were in the ignition. My phone was in the cup holder. Everything I needed was in that car with that thing. I stood there in the rain for what felt like an eternity, trying to decide what to do. And then, slowly, he turned his head away from me. He was looking forward now, through the windshield, up the road toward the crest of the hill. He raised one hand and pointed. I don't remember making the decision to get back in. I just remember opening the door, sliding into the driver's seat, and feeling the cold roll over me like a wave. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me at all, just kept pointing up the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I put the car in drive. I didn't know what else to do. We drove in silence. The rain continued to pour down, and my wipers beat their steady rhythm, and the thing in the passenger seat sat perfectly still. Every few seconds I'd glance over at him, and every time his smile was exactly the same. Fixed, unwavering. His hand stayed raised, pointing forward, guiding me up the hill. The road got worse, narrower. The trees closed in until branches scraped along both sides of the car. I saw old mile markers half buried in weeds, their numbers long since worn away, driveways that led to nothing, mailboxes for families that didn't exist anymore. And then, at the crest of the hill, I saw the tree. It stood alone in a small clearing, massive and dead, its bark blackened and split from an old lightning strike. The branches reached up into the storm like skeletal fingers, and hanging from one of those branches, swaying in the wind, was a rope. Thick hemp rope, weathered gray, with a noose at the end. The man in my passenger seat lowered his hand. Home, he whispered, and then he was gone. No fade, no mist, no dramatic exit. One moment he was sitting next to me, and the next moment the seat was empty. Just wet. Like someone had been sitting there dripping rainwater. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, staring at that tree, at that rope. The storm raged around me, but I couldn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was that dry, papery voice echoing in my head. Wrong way home. Eventually, I put the car in reverse and backed down the hill. I didn't turn around until I was a half-mile away, and I took Route 55 home even though it added an hour to my drive. I looked it up later. Gallows Hill Road used to end at that clearing. The road continued on the other side. Still does, technically. But the county closed that section back in 1973 after 3 people disappeared on it in the same year. They never found the bodies. The local paper said it was probably the weather, the isolation, the condition of the road. But my grandfather's generation knew better. They said the hanged men still walked those hills, said they'd stand in the road and smile at you, and if you stopped, if you let them in, they'd take you back to where they died. Because that's what you did when you were lost. You went home. I quit my job at the plant 2 weeks later. Moved to Winchester. I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it, and I've never taken a back road since. Some shortcuts aren't worth the time you save, but sometimes when it rains hard enough, I catch myself checking the passenger seat, making sure it's empty, making sure nobody's sitting there with that too wide smile, waiting to show me the wrong way home. I was 17 the autumn I climbed that bell tower, and I've spent every day since wishing I'd left well enough alone. Our town sits in a valley so narrow the sun only touches Main Street for about 4 hours a day, even in summer. By October, dusk comes early and stays late, pooling in the streets like cold water. The Presbyterian church stands at the north end of town, white clapboard gone gray with age, its bell tower reaching up through the trees like a crooked finger. Every evening at dusk, that bell rings once. Just once. A single, clear note that carries across the valley and seems to hang in the air long after it should have faded. I'd heard it my whole life. We all had. It was as much a part of the town as the mountains themselves, as unremarkable as breathing. My grandmother used to stop whatever she was doing when it rang, bow her head for just a moment, then carry on. I asked her about it once when I was small. She just said, "That's the evening bell, sugar, always has been." When I pointed out that nobody rang it, that the church didn't even hold services anymore except for funerals, she got a strange look on her face and told me to go play outside. Pastor Webb had been the church's caretaker for as long as anyone could remember, though I don't think he'd actually preached a sermon in decades. He was old in that way where you can't quite pin down how old. Could have been 60, could have been 90. He lived in the small house behind the church and spent his days sweeping the steps, pulling weeds from the cemetery, and sitting on the bench by the front door, watching people pass. He always had this expression, like he was waiting for something he knew was coming but hoped might not. The bell started bothering me that fall. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I was getting ready to leave for college. Becoming aware of my town in a way I hadn't been before, seeing it as the strange, closed-off place it really was. Or maybe it was because of what happened to Danny Pritchard. Danny was a year ahead of me in school, the quiet kid who kept to himself mostly. That September, he started acting off. He'd fall asleep in class with his head on his desk, and when teachers woke him, he'd jerk up with this terrified look like he didn't know where he was. At lunch, I saw him sitting alone, staring at nothing, his sandwich untouched. People said he wasn't sleeping, that his mom had found him standing in their backyard at 3 a.m, just standing there in his pajamas, looking toward the church. One evening, in late September, Danny walked into the woods north of town and didn't come back. They found him 3 days later, curled up at the base of an old hemlock about 2 miles in. He was alive, barely, muttering about bells and voices and something he called the ones below. He kept saying they were angry, that the ringing was all that kept them quiet, that someone had to keep ringing or they'd wake up. The EMTs said it was exposure, dehydration, maybe drugs. But Danny's eyes had this emptiness to them, like something had scooped out whatever made him Danny and left just the shell. They sent him to a facility downstate. His family moved away before Halloween. Nobody talked about it much after that, the way people in small towns don't talk about things that make them uncomfortable. But I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. About the bells and the ringing and something waking up. That's when I started paying real attention to our evening bell. I'd stop whatever I was doing when dusk started creeping in and listen. The thing was, Pastor Webb was never in the tower when it rang. I'd see him on his bench or working in the cemetery or closing up the church for the night, always somewhere visible, always accounted for. So who was ringing it? I asked my dad about it one night at dinner. He set down his fork and gave me a long look. "It's the wind or the building settling or something," he said. "Old churches make noise. That's all it is." "But it's always at the same time," I said. "Always at dusk, and it's always just once. Old buildings got their rhythms," he said, and there was an edge to his voice I'd never heard before. "Drop it, please." Mom reached over and squeezed my hand, and I saw something in her face, not quite fear, but close. More like resignation, like she'd asked these same questions once and learned not to push, but I couldn't drop it. The next day, I went to the county library and looked through old newspapers on the microfiche machine. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, just anything about the church, about bells, about why a whole town would accept something so strange without question. I found a story from 1952 about the bell rope being cut. Apparently, some kids had snuck into the tower one night and rung the bell over and over as a prank. The article was brief, matter-of-fact, but it mentioned that 3 people in town had died that week: an elderly woman in her sleep, a man in a car accident, and a child who drowned in the creek behind the elementary school. The paper didn't connect these events, but the timing stuck with me. A week after the prank, the church trustees voted to cut the rope and padlock the tower door. The article quoted Pastor Webb, who was young then, saying it was for everyone's safety. But if the rope had been cut in 1952 and the door locked, how had the bell been ringing every evening for the last 70 years? I went to see Pastor Webb on a grey afternoon in mid-October. He was raking leaves in the cemetery, moving slowly, methodically. When he saw me coming up the path, he stopped and leaned on his rake, watching me with those watery blue eyes. "Pastor Webb," I said, "can I ask you something about the bell?" His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You can ask," he said. "How does it ring if the rope's been cut?" He was quiet for a long time, looking past me toward the mountains. "You planning to leave for college next fall?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir." "Good, you should." He went back to raking. "Some questions don't need answering. Some things work best when you leave them be." But Danny Pritchard went looking for answers in the wrong places, he said, and now there was something sharp in his voice. "He went into those woods at night. He went digging around in things that weren't his to dig in. You want to end up like Danny. I just want to understand." He stopped raking and looked at me directly. "The bell rings at dusk. It's always rung at dusk. It'll keep ringing long after you and I are gone. That's all you need to know." He paused, then added quietly, "Please don't go up there. Please." The way he said it, like he was begging, made my skin prickle. But it also made up my mind. I waited until a Friday evening when I knew Pastor Webb would be gone. He drove into the next town over every Friday to buy groceries and usually didn't get back until after dark. I'd watched his routine enough times to know. The church door was never locked during the day, one of those small town things, the idea that a church should always be open. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, just as dusk was starting to gather in the corners of the valley. Inside, the church was dim and cold, smelling of old hymnals and furniture polish. Dust moved in the slanted light from the high windows. The pews stood empty, waiting for congregations that rarely came anymore. I'd been inside before, of course, for funerals and the occasional Christmas service, but never alone, never with this sense of trespass. The door to the bell tower was at the back, behind the altar. It was smaller than I'd expected, and newer. The wood didn't match the rest of the church. The padlock hung from the latch, but it wasn't closed. It dangled there, open, like someone had forgotten to snap it shut, or like I was expected. My hand was shaking when I reached for the doorknob. I almost turned around then. Almost. But I thought about Danny Pritchard and the way everyone in town went quiet when the bell rang, like they were all part of some unspoken agreement, some collective willful ignorance. I needed to know. The door opened with a creak that seemed too loud in the empty church. Beyond it, narrow stairs climbed up into darkness. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, then started climbing. The stairs were steep and worn, the wood soft under my feet in places. The walls pressed close on either side, and the higher I climbed, the colder it got. Not the gradual cold of autumn air, but something immediate and unnatural, like I was descending into water instead of climbing into air. My breath came out in visible puffs. The stairs seemed to go on forever, turning and turning, and I started to wonder if I'd somehow gotten turned around, if I was going down instead of ups. But then the stairs ended at another small door, this one old and weathered, and when I pushed it open, I stepped into the bell tower. It was smaller than I'd imagined, barely 10 feet across, with open arches on all four sides looking out over the town. The bell hung in the center, massive and dark with age, suspended from thick beams that looked original to the building. The rope that had once hung from it had been cut, just like the article said. I could see the frayed end tied to the bell's crown, the rest of it gone. The cold was worse up here, pressing against me like something physical. I could see my breath in thick clouds. It was the kind of cold that gets into your bones, that makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. And there was a smell, faint but distinct. Old flowers and wet earth, like a funeral, like a grave opened too soon. I walked around the bell examining it. There were marks on it, scratches and dents that could have been age or could have been something else. I reached out to touch it, and the metal was so cold it burned. I jerked my hand back. That's when I noticed the wall behind the bell. There was writing on it, carved into the old wood. Not fresh, but not ancient either. The letters were still clear, cut deep. I moved closer, shining my phone's light on the words. "Keep ringing, or they wake." The words were repeated over and over, carved in different hands, different depths, covering the wall from floor to ceiling. Some were neat and careful, others were jagged, desperate, scratched rather than carved. At the bottom, barely visible, were older words, so faded I had to lean close to read them. 7 bells to bind them, 7 bells to hold them, 7 bells to keep them sleeping. Ring the evening, ring the evening, ring the evening, or all is lost. My heart was hammering now, and the cold seemed to intensify, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I heard a sound from below, a scraping like something moving across the church floor, or like something moving under it. I checked my phone, 5:47 p.m. dusk. The bell would ring any moment. I stood there, frozen, waiting. The cold grew worse, and now I could hear something else. A sound like breathing, but too slow, too deep, coming from somewhere below, somewhere far below the church. The smell of earth and flowers grew stronger, and with it came something else. The smell of decay, of things long buried. And then I felt it. Something moved past me in that small space, something I couldn't see but could feel as surely as I'd feel a person brushing against me. The air displaced. The smell intensified, and I heard, very faintly, a sound like whispering, like many voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing. The bell rang. It was louder than I'd ever heard it from the ground, deafening in that small space, and I clapped my hands over my ears and stumbled back against the wall. But the sound went through me anyway, vibrating in my chest, in my teeth, in my bones. And as it rang, I felt something change. The presence, the thing that had brushed past me, seemed to retreat, seemed to sink, like something submerging. The whispering faded. The cold lessened just slightly. The bell's note hung in the air, slowly fading, and I stood there shaking, trying to understand what I'd just felt. The bell hadn't rung itself. Something had rung it. Something had struck it, though I'd seen nothing, though I'd been standing right there. And whatever it was, it had been there with me the whole time, waiting for dusk, waiting to ring the bell, to keep ringing, to keep something else, something worse, from waking. I don't remember climbing back down the stairs. The next thing I knew, I was outside the church, gasping in the evening air, and Pastor Webb was standing on the path, his grocery bags at his feet, staring at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not anger, not disappointment, just a deep, profound sadness. "You went up," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, still shaking. "What did you feel?" "Something was there," I whispered. Something rang the bell. He picked up his bags and walked past me toward his house. "Every evening," he said quietly, "someone has to ring the bell. After the rope was cut, after the door was locked, someone still had to ring it." So they stayed. 7 of them. The ones who knew what was down there, the ones who agreed to keep watch, even after. He paused at his door, his back to me. "They gave up their rest to keep the rest of us safe, and they'll keep ringing that bell until there's nothing left of them at all. Then someone else will have to take their place." "What's down there?" I asked. "What are they keeping asleep?" He looked back at me, and I saw tears on his weathered face. "Pray you never find out," he said, "and pray that bell never stops ringing." I left for college the following fall and never went back except for my father's funeral 3 years later. I stayed for 2 days, long enough to hear the bell ring at dusk, that single clear note carrying across the valley. Long enough to see Pastor Webb's grave in the cemetery, fresh flowers on the headstone. Long enough to learn that no one knew who was taking care of the church now, but that it was still standing, still open, and the bell still rang, every evening at dusk, exactly on time. I live in a city now, far from those mountains, far from that valley. But sometimes, as the sun sets and the shadows grow long, I'll stop whatever I'm doing and listen. And I swear, faint and far away, I can still hear it, that single note, that desperate, faithful ringing. And I wonder how much longer they can keep it up, how much longer until there's no one left to ring, how much longer until something wakes. And I wonder if, when I'm gone, when my time comes, I'll be given a choice. To rest or to climb those stairs. To let the darkness rise or to take my turn with the rope that isn't there anymore, ringing a bell that rings itself, keeping something terrible asleep for just one more day, one more evening, one more dusk. Keep ringing or they wake. I understand now. God help me, I understand. I was 17 the last time I stood in front of that house on Birch Lane. It was August of 1999, and I remember the cicadas screaming so loud you could barely think straight. My mama had just passed, and Daddy said we were moving to Richmond to live with my aunt. I didn't want to go, but you don't get a say at 17 when your whole world's been pulled out from under you like a rug. The day we left, I walked past that empty house, one last time. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Paint peeling like dead skin, windows dark as coal. People said it belonged to some family that just up and vanished in the 60s, left everything behind. No one ever came to claim it, and no one ever went inside. It just sat there, rotting slow like everything else in those mountains. I didn't come back for 20 years. Life took me other places. College, a marriage that didn't stick, jobs that paid just enough to keep me from thinking too hard about where I came from. But when Daddy got sick, really sick, I knew I had to go home. The drive back into those hills felt like moving backward through time. Same twisting roads, same kudzu choking the trees, same feeling of the mountains pressing in on you from all sides. When I finally rolled into town, it was like nothing had changed at all. Same Dollar General, same rusted-out cars in the same front yards, same faces aged 20 years but still wearing the same expressions. I stayed at Daddy's place. The house was smaller than I remembered, darker, and spent my days at the hospital watching him fade. The doctors said maybe weeks, maybe days. There wasn't much else to do but drive around at night, trying to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. That's when I started noticing the house on Birch Lane again. The first time I drove past, it was late October, just after sunset. The mountains were doing that thing where they swallow the light too fast, leaving everything in this gray-blue twilight that makes you feel like you're underwater. I was taking the long way back from the hospital, not ready to sit alone in Daddy's empty house yet, when I saw it. The house on Birch Lane had a light on, not just any light. The upstairs window on the left side was glowing warm and yellow, like someone was up there reading or getting ready for bed. I slowed down without meaning to, staring at that window. Someone must have finally bought the place, I thought. Fixed it up, good for them. But the house didn't look fixed up. The paint was still peeling, the porch still sagging, the yard still overgrown with weeds tall enough to hide a child. Just that one light burning upstairs, steady and warm. I drove past it every night after that. I told myself it was just the route I was taking, but really I was curious. Who would move into a place like that? Why wouldn't they fix it up first? The light was always on, always that same upstairs window. I never saw a car in the driveway, never saw anyone coming or going. Just that light waiting there in the dark. It was a Wednesday night, maybe 2 weeks after I first noticed it, when I saw the figure. I was driving slower than usual. The fog had rolled in thick off the mountain, the kind that turns your headlights into useless murk. The house appeared out of the gray like something surfacing from deep water, and that window was glowing the way it always did. But this time, there was someone standing there. I could see the silhouette clear as day, a person-shaped shadow against the warm light, and as I watched, it moved, raised one arm, waved. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I should have kept driving, should have pressed the gas and gotten the hell away from there, but I didn't. I waved back. I don't know why. It was just instinct, the kind of thing you do when someone waves at you, even when every rational part of your brain is screaming that something's wrong. The second my hand lifted off the wheel in that stupid little wave, the porch light clicked on. I hit the brakes without meaning to, my truck lurching to a stop in the middle of the empty road. The porch light was one of those old yellow bulbs, the kind that flickers and hums with moths. It cast long shadows across the sagging porch, and in that sickly light, I watched the front door swing open. Not fast, not like someone pushed it. Slow and deliberate, like an invitation. I sat there with my engine running, my breath fogging up the windshield, telling myself to drive away. But there was something pulling at me. Something I couldn't name, a feeling like remembering a dream you'd forgotten. I put the truck in park, turned off the engine. The silence that rushed in was so complete it felt like pressure on my eardrums. Even the cicadas had gone quiet. I got out of the truck. The fog wrapped around me immediately, cold and damp, carrying the smell of rotting leaves and something else underneath. Something sweet and wrong. Like fruit left to ferment. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked up the driveway. The house loomed above me, bigger than it should have been, and that open door was a mouth of darkness waiting to swallow me whole. I should have turned back. I should have gotten in my truck and never come down this road again. But my feet kept moving, carrying me up those porch steps, across boards that groaned under my weight, right up to that threshold. I stood there looking into the darkness beyond that door, and that's when I smelled it. Mama's perfume. That cheap stuff she used to buy at the grocery store, the kind that came in a pink bottle and smelled like fake roses. I hadn't smelled it in 20 years, but I knew it immediately. The way you know your own name. It was coming from inside the house. I stepped through the door. The inside was dark, but not completely. There was light coming from somewhere deeper in the house, a soft glow that let me see just enough. And what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The furniture was all there, the same furniture I remembered from when I was a kid. Not furniture that looked similar, the exact same pieces. The brown couch with a cigarette burn on the left armrest, the coffee table with my carved initials on the underside, the TV with a crack in the corner of the screen from where I'd thrown a toy truck during a tantrum when I was 6. Everything was exactly as I'd left it in 1999. My shoes appeared by the door, the ones I'd been looking for the day we moved. My jacket hung on the coat rack, still dusty from the last time I'd worn it. On the coffee table sat my homework. I could see my own handwriting, that stupid essay about Romeo and Juliet I never turned in because we'd left town. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, like it had been sitting here untouched for 2 decades just waiting. "Hello?" My voice came out wrong, too loud in the thick silence. No one answered, but I could hear something now, a sound coming from upstairs. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above my head, back and forth, like someone pacing. I looked at the staircase, the same staircase from our old house, the same worn carpet runner, the same family photos on the wall going up, pictures of me and Mama and Daddy, pictures that should have been in a box at Daddy's house, not here. I climbed the stairs. Each step creaked in a familiar rhythm, and with each creak, I felt like I was sinking deeper into something I couldn't understand. The smell of Mama's perfume got stronger the higher I went, mixed now with something else. The smell of the hospital, that antiseptic scent that clings to everything near the end. At the top of the stairs, I saw the light spilling out from under the door on the left. The same door that led to my old bedroom. The footsteps had stopped. Everything was silent except for my own breathing, too fast and too shallow. I reached for the doorknob. It was cold under my palm, so cold it almost burned, but I turned it anyway. The door swung open. My bedroom looked exactly as I'd left it. Posters on the walls, bands I'd forgotten I loved, movies I'd seen 100 times. My bed, unmade the way I always left it. My desk with my notebooks and CDs scattered across it. Even my clothes were there, draped over the chair the way I'd left them that last morning. But sitting on the edge of my bed, backlit by the lamp on my nightstand, was a figure. It was me. Or something wearing my shape. It looked exactly like I had at 17. Same long hair, same band t-shirt, same worn jeans. But there was something wrong with its eyes. They were too dark, too empty, like looking into wells that go down forever. It stared at me without blinking, without moving, and when it spoke, it used my voice from 20 years ago. "You came back," it said. Not a question, a statement of fact. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there in the doorway while this thing wearing my teenage face smiled at me. "I've been waiting," it said. "We all have." "Who?" I managed to choke out. "Who's we?" It stood up, and that's when I realized it wasn't casting a shadow. The lamplight passed right through it like it was made of smoke or memory. "Everyone who left something behind," it said. "Everyone who ran away. We all end up here eventually, in the house that remembers." It moved toward me, and I stumbled backward into the hallway. But the hallway was wrong now. It stretched longer than it should. Doors lining both sides, dozens of them, all slightly open with light spilling out. I could hear voices coming from behind those doors. Familiar voices. Voices of people I'd known, people I'd lost, people I'd forgotten. I heard Mama calling my name. I heard Daddy laughing the way he used to before he got sick. I heard my own voice, younger and younger, echoing from different rooms. "You can stay," the thing said, still walking toward me with my teenage face. "Everything you left behind is here, everything you miss. You never have to leave again." I turned and ran. Ran down those stairs, my feet barely touching the steps, while behind me I could hear doors opening, could hear footsteps following, could hear voices calling my name in tones that were loving and desperate and wrong. I hit the bottom floor and ran for the front door, but it was further away than it should have been, the house stretching and warping around me. The furniture watched me pass. I swear to God it watched me, inanimate objects turning to track my movement with attention that shouldn't exist. I finally reached the door and exploded out onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I didn't stop running until I was in my truck. Engine started, tires spitting gravel as I tore away from that house. I looked in the rear-view mirror once. The porch light was off. The upstairs window was dark. The door was closed, like nothing had happened at all. I didn't drive down Birch Lane again. Started taking the long way around, even though it added 20 minutes to the drive. Daddy passed 3 days later, peaceful in his sleep, and I buried him next to Mama in the cemetery on the hill. I put the house up for sale and left town the same day the papers were signed. Haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about that house. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. If I'd walked back into that bedroom and sat down next to that thing wearing my face. If I'd let it keep me there with all those other lost pieces of the past. Part of me, a part I don't like to think about, wonders if that would have been so bad. To go back, to stay in that moment before everything changed, to never have to leave again. Last week, I got a letter. No return address, postmarked from my hometown. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the house on Birch Lane, and there in the upstairs window, backlit by that warm yellow light, was a figure. It was waving. I haven't waved back yet. But the photograph is still on my kitchen table, and every night before bed I pick it up and look at it. The light in that window is so warm, so welcoming, and I remember how everything was exactly as I'd left it, preserved perfect and waiting. I wonder if it's still waiting. I wonder if I'll drive back there someday, walk through that door, and finally stay where I belong. In the house that remembers. In the house that never lets go. The worst part is I'm starting to think I want to.